If you're like me and are really into World War II history and also spend way too much time on the internet, then you've probably seen memes like this. This one here is a bit unusual because it does actually acknowledge Britain and China's contributions. But other people will claim that the Soviet Union did most of the work when it came to winning the Second World War, and that America's contributions to the ultimate Allied victory are over-exaggerated, to say the least. This is often accompanied by claims that Hollywood brainwashed people into thinking that it was actually America who was responsible for winning World War II instead of the Soviets. And let's be fair, we have to acknowledge that it was in America's interests during the Cold War to downplay Soviet accomplishments. It's also basic business sense that Hollywood was going to be making more movies about D-Day than Stalingrad. Similarly, the Soviet Union and later Russia made movies about Stalingrad, while the British made movies about Dunkirk, and China makes movies about the Battle of Shanghai. Of course, the Soviet Union had their own narrative they were invested in, where they said that they were the ones responsible for victory over the Axis as well. 5 years after the Battle of Berlin, the Soviet Union produced a film about the battle, and it sort of claims that the Western Allies weren't really fighting the Nazis, and that they were kind of on the same side. There are multiple reviews of this movie on YouTube. It's incredible how much falsehood is presented as fact in that film. After the fall of the Soviet Union, it became okay for Westerners to like Russia again, and that allowed for there to be a new appreciation of the Soviet accomplishments in World War II. Like when I was a teenager, hating Russia was pretty much just a boomer thing to do. And then in 2014, Western public opinion turned against Russia again. And then in 2022, Western public opinion really turned against Russia. So I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing people push back more against the idea that the Soviets were the ones who actually defeated the Axis. But let's try to put our political biases aside and look at the facts. Was Allied victory in World War II mostly a Soviet accomplishment, with America's efforts being a sideshow? Let's look at the big picture. Most of the Soviet Union's accomplishments in World War II were on the Eastern Front against Germany. Fans of the Soviet Union will point out that the majority of German military deaths were inflicted by Soviet soldiers, and they often point to the millions of Soviet soldiers who died fighting Germany. Using the Soviets' high casualties as a point in their favor is Hearts of Iron 4 logic, and if you think about it, it kind of makes the opposite point than the one they're trying to make. Nevertheless, over 4 million Wehrmacht soldiers died fighting the Soviets, compared to less than 1 million who died fighting America, Britain, and France combined. And that's a very strong point in favor of the Soviet Union. A lot of people will counter by saying that the only way the Soviet Union survived the war was due to Lend-Lease from America and Britain. There's also this idea that the German soldier was just superior to the Russian soldier, and that Germany only lost on the Eastern Front because hordes of conscripts overwhelmed them, or that Russia's General Winter defeated Germany. But this view is wrong. During Operation Barbarossa, the Red Army was actually outnumbered by their Axis counterparts. And the advantage that Winter gave the Soviets is over-exaggerated. The Red Army defeated the Wehrmacht on the battlefield, and that's why Germany lost on the Eastern Front. Now let's talk Lend-Lease. There's a myth that Lend-Lease is what prevented the Germans from pushing all the way to the Urals. But the German advance had already been stopped by the time that most of the American and British supplies arrived. The real benefit of Lend-Lease was that the Soviets would have superior logistics and the supplies to go on the offensive against Germany and push them all the way back to Berlin. America provided over 400,000 trucks to the Soviet Union. That's a lot of trucks. Without Lend-Lease, the Eastern Front would likely have seen a long stalemate. I think you can see that without the Western Allies, the Eastern Front looks a lot different. The Western Allies get criticized for not doing enough to fight Germany throughout the war. You'll hear that America and Britain waited a long time to open a second front. After all, there was almost 4 years in between the surrender of France in 1940 and the Normandy landings in 1944. But it's not like the Western Allies were doing nothing during that time. For one thing, they were getting all that war material into the Soviet Union. And while supplies were being sent to both the Soviet Union and Britain, the Western navies had to fight and defeat the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy. The Western Allies also bombed German cities throughout the war. While some have questioned the importance of the bombing campaign to the Allies' ultimate victory, given that the Germans were able to increase production through most of the war, the bombings had a tremendous impact on German morale and diverted production as they needed to build anti-aircraft guns when they could have been building artillery. The bombing of Germany also diverted the Luftwaffe's attention from the Eastern Front to the West. But let's get back to the accusation that the Allies waited to open a second front. Let me be clear that lots of people who claim that the Soviet Union won World War II by themselves are not communists. But among those who are, they'll often say that the only reason that the Western Allies invaded Normandy was to prevent the Soviets from conquering all of Europe and making it all communist. But this is a really silly claim because the Western Front from June 1944 to May 1945 was not the Second Front. The Eastern Front was the Second Front. By the time Operation Barbarossa commenced, Britain had already been fighting on another front on land for over a year. That first front was the North African Campaign, which began 2 weeks before the fall of France and lasted nearly 3 years, resulting in an Allied victory. After pushing the Axis out of North Africa, the Allies invaded Italy. Germany diverted hundreds of thousands of soldiers to Italy to fight the Americans, British, and other allies. The Americans, Canadians, and British opened a third front in 1944 with the D-Day invasion. This was in addition to the ongoing fighting in Italy. This caused Germany to divert soldiers from the east to the west. A lot of those soldiers who fought in the Battle of the Bulge later that year and early into 1945 could have been sent to fight the Soviets. And because the Western Allies treated Axis prisoners of war humanely, well, usually, in 1945, German soldiers were rushing to surrender to the Americans and British. And a surrendered enemy soldier is just as good as a dead enemy soldier. While America obviously had greater manpower and resources that it provided to the Allied cause, we can't discount Britain. After all, they fought Germany for 3 years before America entered the war. From June 1940 to June 1941, the fight against Germany was mostly a British effort. The resilience of the British military and the British people played a major role in the ultimate victory. When it comes to the defeat of Germany, I'm not sure if you can give one country the most credit. It really was a team effort of the UK, USSR, and USA. Countries like France, Poland, Canada, and others played a minor role. I would give the Soviet Union a slight edge over America and Britain if not for the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The Soviet Union invaded Poland and continued to supply the German war effort for a year and a half, so that's a major mark against them. Of course, Germany wasn't the only Axis power, something that Soviet fanboys neglect. Moving on to Germany's allies in Eastern Europe. These are the puppet states of Slovakia and Croatia, along with Finland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. It's pretty obvious that they were defeated by the Soviet Union. America and Britain played a minor role as they were the ones supplying the Red Army, and they also did some bombing, but defeating them was mostly a Soviet accomplishment. Italy, the laughingstock of World War II. Italy joined the war in 1940, shortly before the fall of France. This opened up the North African Front. Until 1942, Britain and its Commonwealth nations were doing most of the fighting. Then the United States entered North Africa, and Free France began to play a larger role as well. After Allied victory in North Africa, Sicily, and then continental Italy was invaded. Italy surrendered in 1943, but then Germany invaded Italy and put Mussolini back in charge as a puppet leader. Fighting in Italy continued until 1945. The defeat of Italy was mostly an Anglo-American operation. You could say that the Soviets played a role, as Italy did send some troops to the Eastern Front, but overall, France did more to defeat Italy than the Soviets. Now let's get to Japan. And with Japan, I'm also counting their puppet states in China. Japan was the Axis power that fought the longest, at over 8 years. This is compared to Germany, which fought for less than 6 years, and Italy, which fought for less than 5. For more than 4 years, from July 1937 to December 1941, China was doing all the fighting against Japan, though they did receive some help from the US and the Soviet Union. The Western Allies got involved in December 1941, while the Soviet Union got involved in August 1945, right before the end of the war. For the first half of the war against Japan, China was doing most of the work. After Pearl Harbor, America stepped up its efforts to help China, and Britain would help too. Though China didn't receive anywhere near as much as the Soviet Union did, partly because of logistical difficulties, Lend-Lease to China helped in their fight against Japan. Chinese soldiers also helped America and British Commonwealth forces in Burma. China's role in World War II gets very little coverage in Western countries, but they did play an important role. Britain and her Commonwealth countries played an important role on sea and in Burma. Soldiers from India, Australia, and New Zealand were important in this theater. But America did the majority of the fighting in the Pacific and inflicted higher casualties on Japan. And while America lost land in the war, it was the power that was doing the most to take land back from Japan. The island hopping campaign, the liberation of the Philippines, etc. The US Navy was victorious over the Japanese Navy, and the same could be said about the Air Force. As for the Soviet Union, they did help China for a little bit, and they clashed with Japan in 1939, and then fought Japan for the final 3 weeks of the war. The invasion of Manchuria meant that virtually the whole world was against Japan, and in conjunction with the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, this caused Japan to surrender. So it was an important part of the war, despite not lasting long. If the Soviets didn't invade, I don't know whether or not Japan would surrender. This has been the subject of debate for quite some time now. But still, the Western Allies in China did a lot more fighting than the Soviets did on this theater. America did the most to defeat Japan, with the British Commonwealth and China also playing major roles. The Soviet Union and the Netherlands played minor roles in this theater. Hopefully, you now have a greater appreciation for how much of a team effort the Allied victory was. The big four Allied powers were Britain, China, the Soviet Union, and the United States, and they all earned their place in the UN Security Council after the war. So, are American achievements in World War II over exaggerated? Maybe among uneducated people they are, but for people who are actually interested in World War II history, if anything, the American contributions to victory are under exaggerated. Because America played a significant part in victory in pretty much every front of the war, whether their contribution was soldiers on the battlefield or supplies for the other allies, it's really hard to over exaggerate how important they were to winning the war. So, if anything, America and not the Soviet Union was the Allied MVP. The Soviets clearly didn't win by themselves, as some would have you believe. And that's pretty much the whole point of making this video. I don't want to downplay the accomplishments of British, Soviet, Chinese, Polish, Dutch, or French soldiers. I just wanted to debunk tankies and other Soviet fanboys who act as if their favorite country was responsible for winning the whole war. Well, what do you think? Is my own bias in favor of America clouding my judgment? Leave a comment to let me know.